Welcome to day 2 of Discussing the American by Henry James. Let's get started by just considering what you read yesterday. Yesterday you met our main character, our protagonist, Christopher Newman. And you found that he is a self-made businessman. I want to point out that he is such a successful businessman that he is going to be able to fund the rest of his life with his earnings. And you saw him go through or describe for us that transforming moment. Here he was on his way to pursue another business success. And in doing so, he was also wrapping in the opportunity of seeking revenge against another businessman. And he sort of just comes out of himself for a moment and has this moment of clarity when he realizes that life is more than these business pursuits and stepping on others and seeking revenge. And he just does not want to be that person who does that. He doesn't want to seek revenge anymore. And so he actually just stops what he's doing and he just leaves and he goes to Europe. He decides he's going to see what else there is to life and he's going to enjoy and take in the culture and travel. He also thinks, you know what, I'm going to see about perhaps thinking about marriage. And so he's going to pursue the idea of getting married and having a wife and a family. So we see that he reconnects with somebody that's from America, a fellow American who he knew from the Civil War. And this man's name is Tom Tristram. And later we meet his wife, Mrs. Tristram, and they're present throughout the story. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on them because we're not doing a whole novel here for several days. But if we wanted to, we could contrast even these two characters, Tom Tristram, an American, and Christopher Newman. And if we contrasted them, it would just give us more information, even if you sort of mentally did that as you were reading. It would just inform you even more about just how ideal an American Christopher Newman is, our protagonist. And so he is the ideal American. That is how Henry James designed him as a character. He's morally upright. Now we're going to get into that in just a moment here, but he does make some very good choices for himself. He's sincere. He's a nice looking young man, but he's unassuming about it. Now let's look at that first point, being morally upright from God's perspective. We know that Christopher Newman does have sort of a bent or a weakness for wanting to seek revenge and wanting to make sure that people get what's coming to them. And so if we look at this from God's perspective, we know that that is just not right. That is a bent towards a certain kind of sin, right? In Romans 12, God says, "Bless them which persecute you. Bless and curse not." In verse 19, he says, "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." So we know God's perspective. We're not to seek revenge on this earth. Now, Christopher Newman makes those right decisions in two separate instances, one that you're going to read about today. Ultimately, he discards the idea of revenge. But I want to just talk briefly about his reason. His reason is for his own purposes. He doesn't feel good inside when he's seeking revenge. And let's think about God's perspective. Does God want us to do the right thing because indeed we're going to feel better when we're kind of walking down the wrong path in the wrong direction? We have that horrible feeling inside of us. And when we turn around and change and do the right thing, all of that burden falls off of our shoulders and we feel so much better, don't we? And that is wonderful. That's a wonderful blessing from the Lord that we can have that feeling of relief when we do the right thing. But God looks straight into the heart, does he not? And in 1 Corinthians 10:31, the Bible says, "To all for the glory of God." It says, "Whatsoever ye eat or drink or whatsoever you do all for the glory of God." I'm sort of paraphrasing there. And so really, God's perspective for not seeking revenge or any other sin that we could be pursuing is for his glory. And so that needs to be our heart's call and direction. If we were to fill out a soapstone further on this particular story, we would want to say that the third person narrative is the one that narrates the story. So I need you also to realize that this third person narrative, so let me just explain. We're not talking about first person, so there's no personal pronouns like I and me and our. Okay, the narrator is not joining us in the story. The narrator is outside of the story telling it. But I also want you to notice, and you probably already saw this in your reading, he's telling it from Christopher Newman's perspective. So we know a lot more about Christopher Newman and what he's thinking and how he feels than any of the other characters. The occasion, the action predominantly took place in Paris, France, right, in the spring of 1868. We know there's that piece of America and such. And then the audience would have been, at first, readers of the Atlantic Monthly in 1876. That's when this was first published. And it actually ended up being published a year later as a book. It became a 4-act play. The first readers had to wait for each part of the book because it was published serially. So I want you to just notice that. That's often the case. These readers didn't have the luxury of just reading it until they were finished reading for the day, even if they just finished a whole entire novel over several hours. They had to wait because often these books were published month by month in magazine publications. So these would have been educated American and European readers. He actually published from overseas. His publisher was in Boston while he was in Europe, in England. And these readers, of course, would have a bent to being interested in the complexities of human nature and relationships and differentiating between Europeans and Americans. So here are your learning goals for this day. The first one, we already began our practice in this. And so you will have another chapter that you will be able to find more evidences of this psychological realism. By your feedback yesterday, I think that everybody is going to be just fine continuing in that. Those of you who gave feedback, thank you for that. And it looks like you have a handle on that. And indeed, when I looked at your actual assignment, you did accurately identify more psychological realism in the text. So that will continue to be your learning goal for today. You'll have another opportunity in that. Additionally, we want to start identifying the author's contrast of the protagonist and the antagonist, which is going to identify the author's evaluation of Americans versus Europeans. So saying that a little more simplistically, I could just say we are going to be finding details about Christopher Newman, our protagonist, and we're going to be finding details about the Bellegardes that I am about to introduce to you and that you will become quite familiar with as you continue your reading. And you're going to take those details and just make a contrast between the two groups, the Bellegardes, specifically Madame Bellegarde and Christopher Newman. And you're going to see by those details and by those contrasts what Henry James is saying about Americans versus what he thinks of Europeans. So let's meet the Bellegardes. So again, I referenced this yesterday. The Bellegarde, or the name Bellegarde, literally means guards of the beautiful. And so what we have here is this aristocratic family, especially Madame Bellegarde, I want to note, that is guarding or is maintaining the aristocratic tradition, the social traditions, the sustained culture. They don't want change in Europe. They want the rich to be rich and the poor to be poor. They want adherence to all of the sort of hierarchies and the behaviors, the culture in terms of what people should say, what they should look at, what they should involve themselves in, and all of these things. They want to maintain that. And so the idea that Christopher Newman, which you're going to find out more so in the introductory part of chapter 2 than the actual chapter itself, is that Christopher Newman wants to marry their daughter, Claire. And he's just not good enough for them because he is an American. Who cares if he made a lot of money? He is a stupid, uncultured American, not good enough for Madame Bellegarde's daughter. And in fact, she has in mind another man because of he's distasteful to her, and Claire does not want to marry him. And her father understands that she's not going to be happy with this man, and he doesn't want her to marry this man. But Madame Bellegarde, doesn't really care, and that's what I said in the note in the bottom here. She is willing to sacrifice the happiness of her daughter to maintain these societal traditions. Okay, and so anyway, this family, especially Mrs. Bellegarde and her oldest son, are going to provide a contrast between the Christopher Newman and the Europeans. And I'm going to need you to note that. And I'm not really going to teach you how to do that today because I feel like you're going to be able to handle that. So right now, I'm done with this lecture with you, and I would like to give you your assignment and guide you through it. So it is to read the rest of the story. Okay, there's a great introduction that you must read, or I'm afraid you might be a little lacking in your understanding if you don't read it. And then there's chapters 22 and chapters 26, and that's it. That's all we're doing. By the way, you're going to meet a character named Mrs. Bread, and I want you to consider the, what might be important about her name. Why did Henry James want to name her Mrs. Bread? Try to figure that out as well if you can. But you're needing to find 3 more instances of psychological realism, and you're going to start this contrast between the Bellegardes and Newman himself. So very briefly, this is what you're going to do. You're going to get your book out and you're going to read the introductory material. And then instead of reading after the introductory material, instead of reading chapter 22 from the book, please come here and read it here, because I have highlighted areas where you should easily be able to find. In other words, you can find them in other spots as well, but you'll be able to easily find places that are examples of psychological realism. And I just want you to highlight the text where you find them. So say you think it's this, you're just going to highlight that text just like you did in yesterday's assignment, okay? And so then after you do that, you're going to find several spots in this chapter where you can do that, right? Then after you do that, I want you to come down to the bottom here, and I want you to try to find instances as you read chapter 22 and chapter 26. So you'll go back to your book and read chapter 26 and find different examples of who Newman is by his actions, by his words, by his thoughts and ideas, and who the Bellegardes are, especially Madame Bellegarde, but any of them. The older brother would be a good example as well. And just put down the contrast between what Newman thinks and says and does and what the Bellegardes do and think and say. I don't want this to become any kind of stress for you, however. I didn't teach you how to do this in this lecture today. I do feel that you are, as juniors and seniors, very capable of doing this, but I also don't, if it's difficult for you, just reach out to me by email and tell me that you tried. We will further discuss it together tomorrow. Okay, so I just wanted to give you that direction on that. Just do your best. You should be able to see very different conduct in each of them that will help us understand James's differentiations in Americans and Europeans.